Hi, and welcome to PostScript. I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and we come to you on a regular basis with speakers from all kinds of places in the world who have interesting things to talk about the major kind of changes that are going on in the world right now, and the emergence of literally a new world and the transition from this world to the next world. It's part of our speaker series here in Berkeley Springs called Berkeley Springs Transition Talks. And our guest today is Steve McDonald. Steve comes to us from Australia. He's probably come the furthest of any of our guests. And Steve's background is got a varied background in terms of business and in terms of the military. But what's most interesting is he's one of the world's experts on a system developed by a psychologist named Clair W. that built a architecture, a methodology, a dynamics of evolution, essentially, that can describe the past and in a very interesting way can describe the future, and that's what we want to talk about today. And welcome, Steve.
Thanks, John.
Now, in the previous segment, you described the different levels of these evolutionary kind of levels, and I know that they have kind of colors associated with them that make them easy to kind of understand. Can you quickly tell us the different colors?
Sure. So when Don Beck and Chris Cowan wrote the Spiral Dynamics book, they used colors to describe the different levels. So the first level which is an automatic or hunter-gatherer way of living, is beige. And then the second level is purple, which is a tribal way of living. And they used cool colors to describe the individualistic side of the spiral, and then warm colors to decide the even numbers, which is the communal side of the spiral. So they go beige, purple, red for the egocentric level, blue for the absolutistic level, and then orange for multiplistic, and then green for relativistic. And then we have the big leap in consciousness, which takes us to yellow, which is integrative, and then turquoise, which is like an intuitive.
And you would suggest that we're on this edge of this leap in consciousness, kind of worldwide. It happens, by the way, in individuals, and so you see it kind of percolating up different places in the world in terms of individuals and groups getting together and so on. But it also is a global phenomenon, right?
Yeah, that's right. So as I said in the previous segment, if you imagine that humanity is like a conga line of people moving forward through the evolutionary process, and some people are way ahead of the others, there's a bell curve, and then some people are way down the back. And so there are signs that around the early 1900s, there were people already starting to move into yellow, stage 7, which is across this big shift in consciousness. And we saw the emergence of thinking like quantum mechanics, developmental psychology, which is what this model is, and those sorts early signs of those sorts of things way back then. So the interesting thing is we can look at what's happening right now, and we can find small pockets of the future in terms of how people are thinking and behaving.
I gave a talk in Shanghai a couple of years ago, and it was the first time to give a talk in China, and I had this kind of image of these communist Chinese, and all of that. And I found myself, to my amazement, in a room full of these kind of enlightened Buddhist kind of folks who were so different from the kind of the image you thought. And so what I'm taking away from this is that you've seen these kinds of new perspectives and new levels of consciousness showing up all over the world, more so in some places than others, but nevertheless, it's a broadly based kind of phenomena.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it reminds me of that William Gibson quote, the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed.
Yeah. So now work our way up to the top of it, because some folks say that you're going to get telepathy and other kind of things that are associated with this evolutionary process, and so build the last few levels and so that we can start to talk about the future and where this might be going.
Sure, and I believe it is true that as we progress through these different stages, our not just our psychology but our biology changes as well, and there are changes in our sensory systems, and for sure. So if we start with the dominant global paradigm, where we're at right now, which we can see is starting to break down, we're seeing failures in our economic systems, our political systems clearly aren't coping,
right.
When they're not able to solve our problems, and so what happens with each of these stages is, as an individual or a society lives according to the characteristics of this stage, it naturally goes through a process of flowering and then decay. And simply by living in its own way, the decay happens naturally, and that's what we're seeing, okay? Because each stage produces more complexity, and the more complexity it produces, the more it starts to fail to cope. So we're seeing that now with stage 5, the multiplistic way of thinking, which is people would recognise as the scientific, industrial, corporate mindset that's dominating the planet. And we're seeing that it's produced all this amazing technology, and the technology has connected us, and now that we're all connected and there's so much more communication and interaction going on, that these systems, which were actually designed before the internet, are not coping.
That's right.
They're failing.
They're industrial by definition almost.
Exactly, mechanical in nature.
Yeah.
So what's happening is a twofold process. On one hand, these old systems are decaying, and on the other hand, new systems are rising because the complexity is pulling consciousness up, which is bringing new inventions, new behaviours. And we're seeing the emergence of things like digital currency and blockchain technology as a great example of something that's going to be more effective in coping with complexity.
Guys like Ken Wilber have talked about this process, this transition process is holonic. It's a holon. And by that he means that it includes some of the past such that it's familiar enough, but it transcends into some new space.
Yeah.
And if you take too big a step, if you just transcend, then it really is highly disruptive to the existing kind of ability to people to make that kind of adaptation.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing here, what you've just described in terms of blockchain and so on, is a currency, and we can all relate to that, but now in a dramatically different kind of new way. And those kinds of things are happening across the spectrum and almost everywhere in terms of energy production, in terms of education, in a variety of kind of places.
Yeah, that's right. And as I said previously, because the communication technology allows us to spread ideas so quickly, we're seeing a compression in time of the change process. Whereas if you look at the agricultural revolution, it took thousands of years to spread around the world, thousands of years. And now, what happened in thousands of years can happen in decades.
Right.
And
in part, I would argue, facilitated by the internet, which just increases the metabolism of the whole.
Absolutely.
And the distribution and the collection of information, and to be able to aggregate and to find, the way you find solutions on the internet now with Google and any other kinds of ways are just kind of amazing.
Yeah, so whereas the mainstream, the global paradigm is doing this shift from multiplistic stage 5 to relativistic stage 6, which is taking us from individuality back towards collective thinking again, we've got smaller pockets of people who are transitioning further up the spiral.
Right.
So we're seeing the emergence of amazing technology, which is just off the scale. And that, of course, feeds back into the lower level changes. You get this technology trickle down effect where technology that is developed by a more complex way of thinking then becomes available to people who are thinking in more simple ways.
Right.
And
cell phones.
Yeah, AK-47s.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So it's creating a very interesting mix, and with the compression of time, it's bringing our species to a critical point. And while it's true that the dominant global paradigm is shifting from 5 to 6, after 6 we're looking at a quantum leap in human capacity.
So talk about that. What would that look like?
So it's going to require considerable evolutionary tension to cause such a large shift.
What does that mean? Big events on the planet, all kinds of things that drive you into this new space?
Sure. What that means is big challenges for our species. Problems arising that are so far beyond our current capacity to solve that we have to change massively in a natural evolutionary way in order to survive as a species. So we can expect, with the emergence of stage 6 as the dominant paradigm, it's a very permissive, very connected way of being human, and it's going to make all of these previous levels and ways of thinking more obvious and give them more access to global influence, which is just going to create a very rich, complex, chaotic mix of activity and rapid change on the planet. And it's that tension that is going to alchemically transform human consciousness into something way beyond where it is now.
So how does it come together, though, and what are the indicators that suggest what the direction might be?
Sure. How it comes together remains to be seen. But what we can look at is we can look at small pockets. We can look at small pockets where the transformation has already occurred to some extent.
Yeah.
But it's looking back to the 60s. Like the 60s were an early wave of what we're seeing now, as threatening to become the dominant paradigm. But when the 60s happened, all of that stuff was without the internet. So it was like there was no scaffolding for it to hold onto. But now it has the scaffolding of the internet, so it's most likely going to stick. So we're going to see a big backlash initially, and we're already seeing it now, against the scientific industrial paradigm. And so organisations like Occupy, like Anonymous, and the like, we can expect more of that backlash against the dominant paradigm, and supported by the emergence of new technologies which can supersede our current systems. And I think the blockchain technology is one of the most obvious, which threatens to really replace our current economic system in a different way.
I've been convinced for a long time that there's going to be some kind of a breakthrough that integrates a whole lot of different kind of functions in the same way that every other kind of technology or complex technologies come together and become integrated and then more capable, and that is going to suddenly drive you into a space where people can find each other, and they can, whether it's projection, holography, or whatever it turns out to be, that you can suddenly start to replicate people and relationships and conversations and community, for that matter, and aggregate that with information that you could just augmented reality and such that you can, and your capabilities become so much more greater, and so that you can operate. It also empowers individuals, I think, that in rather significant ways.
Yeah, I agree. If we look at places where the relativistic stage 6 has emerged in an organisational sense, we've also learnt so far that it's extremely permissive. It likes to create a level playing field, and it likes to dissolve hierarchies.
Yeah.
So while everybody gets a say in what is an attempt at a very equitable process, we also know that it has weaknesses in an organisation and a leadership sense, where if no single person is taking responsibility for a decision or a process, often it can get lost in the communication process and be devoid of effective action. That's what the early signs of the management style of stage 6 is telling us. And so it remains to see what that's going to mean on a global scale. We've seen the European Union as some sort of an attempt to try and create a situation like that, which is starting to look wobbly.
So how would a company, for instance, operate in that kind of a space? Can you be a little bit more explicit?
Sure.
Because that would be a good example, perhaps, writ large, of what might be coming in larger terms.
Yeah, well, if you just think of a committee-driven process, and if you've got committee members around a table who all have the same value set, and they're all thinking from this stage 6 relativistic place, that can work. Although they tend to put more focus on the process of communication rather than the outcomes.
Yeah, no kidding. I've been in groups. I've been in groups like that.
Because it's all about human-to-human connection. That's the motivating factor. But what that means in a sort of productive sense is, as you just suggested, sometimes the outcomes aren't there. However, you've also got to factor in how other aspects of society are changing. For example, 3D printing. is going to completely transform the manufacturing world.
Yeah.
We no longer send away
Yeah.
to have this made in China and have it shipped back.
Yeah.
We just email the plan to the local 3D printer a block
Yep,
away
yep, yep.
and go pick it up. And so that
Or do it on your counter in your kitchen or something, yeah.
exactly. So that combined with other emerging technologies promises to reduce the cost of living significantly, which could actually
And the number of jobs.
and the number of jobs, exactly. And I think what we'll see is, a diminishing of this rat race that's been created by stage 5, where everybody's got to work as
So it's going to free up a whole lot of time for people.
it is, yeah.
It's going to change the whole notion of work and what value, individual value is. and
Exactly, yeah.
So you don't get compensated necessarily based upon your economic contribution, but maybe, and that's this emergence of these new the places in the world where they're trying to do a minimum kind of
Exactly, yeah.
wage, or
Exactly.
income.
And that extra time should see a flourishing of the arts and all of those sorts of things as well. So, it's potentially the emergence of a very, very different society that's not driven in a way that stage 5 has been driven.
So this is really quite interesting because it's dramatically different. If it's really about creativity and iterative development and lots of free time and the reduction of pressure to be productive and so on, I mean, that's a really different kind of interesting kind of world.
It is, yeah, somewhat utopian even.
Yeah, but you can see the indicators and the pointers.
Absolutely. And I live in a place called Byron Bay in Australia, which is a big alternative lifestyle centre, and we can see the seeds of that happening already. There are local growers producing food that have a local farmers market once a week, and that's a wonderful community hub. And you can see the seeds of this coming. The tricky bit is, as I was saying with this conga line, you've got like a bell curve. So it's all well and good for the folks who are up at stage 6 to be living life this way. And if you can create a bubble effectively, then that's fantastic.
Yeah.
But you've got to interact with the rest of the world.
Right.
You've got to interact with the people who are still living in countries where the life conditions are poor.
Yeah.
They don't have access to clean water. They can't get fresh food. They're being bombed.
Yep.
Those sorts of things. And this is where that extra attention is going to come from, which is going to slingshot us up to the stage,
How does that
the
work?
7th stage.
So how does that play out? I mean,
Well, how I think it will play out is you will see the emergence of bubbles of this new way of living, this stage
I
6.
understand, but what happens to all of the folks on the other side?
So what happens is they got to, humans interact, and so we're already seeing this now. You're going to get folks who are travelling to other countries and blowing things up in order to bring attention to their plight.
Well, that's the negative aspect
Yeah.
of it, but in all of life, what you have is, as you suggested earlier, you have these natural kind of cycles of growth and decrease and so on. And what you're essentially saying is the emergence of a new world and the implosion, if you will, if you want to use that word, of the old kind of world, and will become increasingly dysfunctional, probably, and focused on old ideas.
Well, what we know is that the previous paradigms are very persistent. So it's not so much the implosion, but just the slipping from dominance,
Right.
to a secondary place.
Because you can find medieval places all over the world.
Absolutely. So we're still going to see these systems that are dominant now. They're just not going to be dominant, but they'll be there in different places because you've got pockets and societies all over the world which are progressing up through these systems, and they're not going from 5 to 6. They might be going from 3 to 4 or 4 to 5.
Right.
All of that's going to continue, and
But you'd argue that it's going to be accelerated, right, with the internet and so on. I mean, this whole process.
Absolutely, it's being accelerated. And stage 6, this relativistic way of thinking, tends to try and solve problems by rebalancing things. So the main strategy is to move resources around on a level playing field to try and rebalance things. And the classic example of that is the food to Africa thing, right, which has been going on for years. People in Africa are starving. We send food to them. Fixes the problem, but no, it doesn't fix the problem.
No.
And so we're going to see that on a larger scale, where some of the challenges presented by these differing values and societies which are locked in conflict or they're locked in poverty, trying to deal with the emergence of this utopian world, we're going to see attempts to solve that by rebalancing resources, and we're going to find over the long term that doesn't work. And in fact, it simply creates more complexity, and it's that complexity which is going to drive us
Well,
higher.
I'd argue that you get decentralization in this process, and that you get increased kind of independence and sustainability in these, you called them bubbles earlier, and so if you looked at Africa, for instance, you're going to find a development in Africa that is going to increasingly make them self-sustainable.
Yes.
Because in part some of this new technology and new capabilities coming along, but
I agree. I do agree with you. You know, that there's a general movement upwards globally, and you can look at, you know, rates of poverty and education and those sorts of things globally and see how they're trending upwards for sure. Yeah. But you know, like I said, the complexity of this stage 6 values as a dominant global paradigm, trying to deal with the critical issues that are happening on the planet at the moment, is going to, it's not going to bring resolution. What it's going to bring is greater complexity, which is going to slingshot us up to this higher level of consciousness.
All right, so now what are the relative percentages of, say, the population or something that's in each one of these different?
I don't think anybody really knows, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Can't even guess?
People have guessed, you know. I wouldn't guess personally, but I can say that other people have guessed, you know, within the last 10 years that maybe 10% of the world's population has made this big leap in consciousness to stage 7. I don't know if that's correct.
So then what's after 7? What's 7 and 8?
So let me talk just briefly about 7. So my personal impression of what stage 7 is going to be like is a bunch of first responders arriving at an accident scene or a disaster scene, right? And looking at the planet with, you know, our oceans polluted and problems with population migration and wars and water and you name it, climate change. And saying, okay, let's triage this. What do we need to deal with first in order to secure the future of humanity on the planet? And this will be one of the driving motivations of stage 7. And Clair Graves found this in his research. He found people back in the 50s who were thinking that way, and they were looking at the time at the tension between the superpowers and the threat of nuclear warfare, and worried about the future of our species. So this is built into the psychological pattern of stage 7, is to have a global concern for survival of the species. And interestingly, he found that this was a repeating theme. So if you go right back to stage 1, it's about hunter-gatherer survival, right? And then stage 7 is the emergence of this second tier of values, which is also about survival, but at a global species level. So there's a repeating theme there, and that led him to then look at stage 8 and compare it to stage 2, and he found again a similar theme. So stage 2 was where we first banded together in large tribes to bring greater stability to life, and stage 8, it will be at a global level, a new tribal way of thinking of, you know, humanity as one tribe.
What's that mean?
Well, what it will mean effectively is that after stage 7 has done the first aid, right, the next step is to bring stability to the planet. And so I would expect to see things like the emergence of a kind of global wisdom council, you know, that would supersede
Different governments you're talking?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think government will be very different. It ought to be arranged according to the consciousness of the individuals involved, because by that time we'll have a deeper understanding of levels of human consciousness. So whereas now we get people in government whose capacities are questionable, right, to put it politely.
That's very nice.
By then, we ought to understand human consciousness enough to know that, okay, these folks here are the kind of folks that we want steering the ship. And we'll have a deeper understanding of this relationship between...
By the way, that's the way Singapore works. It's very interesting.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Go ahead.
We'll have a deeper understanding of this connection between the complexity of life conditions and how that impacts human behaviour, and we'll have a greater capacity to change life conditions around the planet in order to nurture the growth and evolution of societies in a much more effective way than we do now. And the outcome of all that will be a more peaceful and a more stable humanity.
You know, in kind of classic kind of understanding of these paradigm shifts historically, what you come to the conclusion is that you're having a giant kind of shift in an increasingly narrow period of time, and that this thing produces a reality that is decipherable, unanticipatable, you cannot make sense out of it from the present reality. And what you're describing is the emergence of a new world that's going to operate in a dramatically different way without work in the terms that we've known it in the past. It's just really quite fascinating. And it's interesting that there is this framework, this architecture that begins to point in that kind of direction. And you can see the emerging pieces of all over the place. It's been nice to have you with us today, Steve McDonald.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for coming from Australia, and thank you for being with us on PostScript. Come back and see us next time.